Somewhere in the Bolivian Altiplano, at over 12,000 feet of elevation, sits a steam locomotive. There are no tracks leading to it. There are no tracks leading away from it. In the jungles of Ecuador, a locomotive has been consumed by vegetation so completely that it is now part of the forest floor. In the Siberian Arctic, a locomotive sits frozen to the spot where it stopped running 70 years ago. How does a machine this large, this expensive, this important, simply get left behind? This is the story of why locomotives get abandoned and the strangest places in the world they ended up. There are thousands of abandoned locomotives scattered across the world. Some are in places you would expect: rail yards, scrap lots, museum storage fields. But some of them are in places that make no sense. Places where the machine could not have been driven to. Places where getting it out would be almost impossible. Every one of these machines was abandoned for a reason. Sometimes that reason was economic. Sometimes it was mechanical. Sometimes it was political. And sometimes the reason has been lost entirely. All that remains is the machine itself and the question of how it got there. The first and most common reason locomotives get abandoned is the simplest. They become obsolete. When American railroads transitioned from steam to diesel power in the 1950s, they retired steam locomotives by the thousands. Most went straight to the scrapper. A steam locomotive that could not be sold to another railroad, preserved by a museum, or repurposed for industrial service had exactly one fate: the cutting torch. But scrapping cost money too. And in an industry that runs on tight margins, sometimes the cheapest thing a railroad could do with an unwanted locomotive was nothing. Park it at the back of a yard. Forget about it. Let the paperwork get lost. Decades later, someone rediscovers a machine that nobody remembers buying or selling. The second reason locomotives get abandoned is economic collapse. When a railroad goes bankrupt, its assets are supposed to be sold or scrapped, but that process is messy. When Penn Central collapsed in 1970, the largest corporate bankruptcy in American history up to that point, locomotives were left scattered across the system in yards and sidings that hadn't been used in years. Some of those machines sat in place for decades after the company that owned them ceased to exist. Court-ordered receivers had no budget to move them. The land they sat on was sold. The new owners inherited locomotives they did not want and could not legally remove. The third reason is the most visually striking. A locomotive breaks down somewhere remote, and the cost to recover it exceeds the cost of the locomotive itself. In logging, mining, and plantation railways built across South America, Africa, and Southeast Asia, locomotives were often operating at the end of single-track branch lines dozens of miles from any repair facility. When a major mechanical failure happened, a cracked frame, a failed boiler, a seized drivetrain, the math was brutal. Sending a recovery crew, specialized equipment, and replacement parts to a remote jungle railhead could cost more than buying a new locomotive outright. So the locomotive got left where it died. Crews walked out. The railway kept operating until a replacement engine arrived, and the broken machine stayed where it stopped, forever. The fourth reason is political. Wars end. Revolutions happen. Colonial empires collapse. And when they do, the infrastructure those governments built often gets abandoned along with the governments themselves. Across Africa and Asia, entire rail networks built during the colonial era were abandoned when newly independent nations could no longer afford to maintain imported equipment. The locomotives were left in place, sometimes on the tracks they last ran on. And there is a fifth reason that almost nobody talks about: liability. A working locomotive is an asset. An abandoned locomotive sitting on a public-facing siding can be a legal disaster. People climb on them. People get hurt. Lawsuits follow. So railroads sometimes deliberately moved retired equipment to the most inaccessible places they could find. Remote sidings, fenced industrial properties, the backlots of facilities miles from any road. The goal was not preservation. It was making the machine someone else's problem. But the reasons are only half the story. The other half, to the part that makes this topic impossible to look away from, is where these machines end up. Because some of them are in places you will not believe until you see them. Our first location is the most famous abandoned locomotive site on Earth, The Great Train Cemetery of Uyuni, Bolivia. Over 100 steam locomotives sit here, slowly dissolving in the salt-heavy air at 12,000 feet of elevation. In the late 1800s, British engineers built an extensive rail network across the Bolivian Altiplano to support the country's booming mining industry. Uyuni was the hub. When the mining industry collapsed in the 1940s, the locomotives became obsolete almost overnight. The country had no industry left to use them and no market willing to buy them. So they were pushed to a siding outside town, and they stayed there for 80 years. The corrosive salt air accelerated the decay. Today, the locomotives are barely recognizable as machines. Their frames are intact, but their bodies are deforming, rusting, slowly being reclaimed by the environment that outlasted them. The cemetery has become a tourist destination. Visitors climb the locomotives, photograph them, wonder at them. But nobody has any plan to remove them. They will sit there until they finish dissolving into the salt. Our second location is harder to photograph because you have to find it first. Deep in the Ecuadorian jungle, along abandoned branch lines that once served banana plantations and logging operations, locomotives sit slowly being absorbed into the rainforest. Ecuador's jungle railways were among the most ambitious infrastructure projects in South American history. British and American companies built narrow-gauge lines through terrain that should have been impossible. When the plantations closed and the logging moved on, the railways were abandoned in place. There was no way to economically remove the locomotives. The terrain that made building the railways so difficult made dismantling them even harder. So the jungle took them. Photographers who find these locomotives today describe having to hack through decades of growth just to reach them. Some have been so completely consumed that only the wheels remain visible. Local rail historians estimate that dozens more remain undocumented somewhere in the Ecuadorian and Peruvian rainforests. They were too remote to recover when they failed. They are too remote to find now. Our third location is one of the most tragic stories in rail history, the Salakard-Igarka Railway, known in Russia as the Dead Road. In the 1940s and 50s, Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin ordered the construction of a rail line across the Siberian Arctic. Nearly 800 miles of track to be built by prisoners from the Gulag labor system. Tens of thousands of prisoners died building it. When Stalin died in 1953, the project was abandoned almost immediately. The rail cars and locomotives that had been shipped north for the project were left where they sat. The permafrost locked them in place. The Arctic preserved them. Today, the Dead Road is a horizontal monument. Hundreds of miles of rusting locomotives and rotting wooden ties stretching across terrain that nobody has any reason to visit. Russian authorities have made no attempt to recover the equipment. The cost of Arctic salvage operations is prohibitive. The political weight of the project's history makes it easier to leave undisturbed. So the Dead Road remains exactly as it was the day it was abandoned. Our fourth location is not on land at all. Off the coast of New Jersey, at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, there are two perfectly preserved 19th century steam locomotives. In 1850, two brand new locomotives were being shipped from a Boston manufacturer to a railway in the southern United States. Their transport ships sank in a storm. The locomotives settled on the ocean floor at a depth of about 90 feet. They have been there for more than 170 years. The cold salt water has preserved them remarkably well. Their frames are intact. The castings are readable. They are some of the oldest surviving American-built locomotives of any kind, and they are on the seabed. They are too deep for casual divers and too fragile for recovery, so they remain where they sank. Two industrial relics from the dawn of American railroading, slowly being colonized by marine life. Our fifth location is not remote at all. It is hiding in plain sight. In Buenos Aires, Argentina, dozens of locomotives sit abandoned in rail yards in the middle of one of South America's largest cities. Argentina once had one of the largest and most sophisticated rail networks in the world. When the national rail system collapsed under economic pressure in the 1990s, rolling stock was simply left where it was parked. Today, locomotives and passenger cars sit in overgrown yards just miles from the city center. Graffiti covers them, vegetation grows through them, and the city lives around them as if they are invisible. Property disputes, government inaction, and the sheer cost of dismantling industrial equipment have kept the yards in a kind of permanent limbo. The city has grown up around them. The locomotives are still there. Nobody is doing anything about it. What every one of these locations has in common is something the railroad industry rarely talks about openly: the decision to walk away. Locomotives are not abandoned by accident. Even the ones that broke down in the jungle were left there because somebody made a decision, a calculated decision. The recovery cost exceeded the asset value, and the cheapest path forward was to stop spending money on the problem. Every locomotive on a railroad's books has a depreciated value. Once that value drops below the cost of moving it, repairing it, or scrapping it, the asset becomes a liability, and liabilities get walked away from. The math is uncomfortable but consistent. A locomotive sitting in a remote yard generates no revenue. It also generates no immediate cost, until it does. Until someone gets injured climbing on it. Until environmental regulations require its removal. Until the land it sits on is sold to a new owner who demands it be cleared. When that day arrives, railroads often choose the cheapest possible solution: partial scrapping, controlled abandonment, or transfer of ownership to local governments or private collectors who become responsible for the cleanup. The abandoned locomotives you see today are the result of decisions made decades ago by people who weighed the cost of removal against the cost of doing nothing. And in case after case, doing nothing won. This is not unique to railroads. Every heavy industry, mining, shipping, manufacturing, has the same story. Equipment too expensive to move, operations too remote to reach, companies that no longer exist to take responsibility. But locomotives are different from abandoned ships or shuttered factories. They are mobile by design. The fact that they ended up stationary, frozen in jungles and deserts and tundra, means something went wrong. Something that nobody fixed. Every abandoned locomotive is a record of an economic calculation, the decision that the machine was no longer worth the cost of moving it. The rail industry moved on. The economies that needed them changed. The world that built them no longer exists, but the machines remain, slowly merging into the places they were left behind. Steel rejoining the earth, human ambition dissolving back into landscape. There are abandoned locomotives on every inhabited continent and a few places where humans barely live at all. Each one was left behind by a decision somebody made, and most of those decisions were never reversed. Subscribe if you want to see more of the forgotten machinery hiding in plain sight. There is more of it out there than you think, and some of it is closer than you realize.